Hi, welcome to the Power Hungry Podcast. I'm Robert Bryce. I'm the host of this podcast where we talk about energy, power, innovation, and politics. And in this episode, I am pleased to welcome my guests, Coilín ÓhAiseadha Ronan Connolly, coming to us from Dublin, Ireland. And I'll talk about why they're on, well, actually, I'll just make it clear. They're the authors of a new paper that just was published in the journal Energies called Energy and Climate Policy, an Evaluation of Global Climate Change Expenditure, 2011 to 2018, which is a mouthful. But we're going to talk about that paper because they have taken a very a broad overview of the issue of renewable energy and in its place in the energy and power systems globally, and it's a very interesting paper. But gentlemen, I could go on and introduce yourself. Coilín, I know you're a medical doctor, and Ronan, you're a PhD. Our custom on this podcast is that you introduce yourselves. So if you don't mind, one of you jump right in and tell us who you are.
Okay, well, I'm a scientist. I've been fascinated by science since I was a teenager.
And sorry to be, you're Ronan. So just
yes.
Everybody else, no one out there knows who you are. So yeah, that's
yeah.
Ronan Connolly is first here. So go ahead.
Yeah. And so I've been studying science since a teenager. Well, for me, a big part of science is that I realized fairly early on that I'm concerned about an over-specialization in science, where people are becoming too specialized. So when I started studying science, I wanted to look at multiple different aspects of it. And this has been a recurring theme throughout my scientific career. I was inspired as well by my father, Dr. Michael Connolly, who is also a co-author on this paper that we will be discussing later on. So I did chemistry and maths in my primary degree. Then I decided to do computer modeling polymer physics as my PhD to try and diversify it. And then after my PhD in 2003, from 2004, I started working full-time with my father in environmental science, developing sustainable methods of fish farming, wastewater treatment, improved energy efficiency, developing new forms of energy storage and things like that. And then around 2009, we both, myself and my father, we said we really should be looking at climate change. Because as environmentalists, this seemed to be the main topic that everybody wanted to investigate. So we started looking critically at what we were doing, but we were finding kind of problems with a lot of the science, which I think, again, roots back to this over-specialization, that there was a lot of lack of joined-up thinking between each of the different disciplines. So myself and my father said we really need to look a bit more carefully, and we spent 5 years looking at all of the data and all of these key studies that were used by the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, and we got a lot of unusual results that were quite surprising to us. And we said, look, let's just put this out to the whole world to see it. So we set up a open peer review journal, and we set up a blog as well, globalwarmingsolved.com, and we said, here's all of our results, and we put it out for open peer review to see what every reaction was. And then on the basis of that, we started collaborating. We started reaching out to the scientific community. Have we made any errors? Can we improve stuff? And all of the feedback was actually surprisingly supportive, when saying that you seem to be onto stuff. And so we started collaborating with people. And just to be clear, I know you've had a long career, and I'm just trying to want to make sure we give Coilín a chance here. But yeah,
but your position now, you're working as an independent researcher.
Yes.
on climate, on energy and power issues now.
Yes, and environmentalism as well,
and environmental issues as well.
Yeah.
So, but you do have an affiliation of the Center I'm sorry, the
Center
Center
for
for
Environment.
Environmental Research and Earth Sciences, CERES.
Yes. So this is ceresscience.com, ceres-science.com, if anybody's interested. And this is myself and a colleague, Dr. Willie Soon, the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. 2 years ago, we said, look, we need to actually be working full-time on climate change and environmentalism and things. And we said, but we don't know where science goes. This is when you're doing science right, you don't know where it will lead you.
Sure.
So we decided we needed to set up a group to just follow the science where it is. So we rely on funding from anybody. So if any of your viewers are interested in supporting it, feel free to donate. There's a PayPal, you can do that. I'll just, one other thing, that since myself and my father launched that, we published, we started collaborating with other scientists. We've published, I think there's 7 papers, including this latest one. And just last year, to segue into Coilín's, how we started collaborating, we've been looking, so in a number of the papers that I published with Michael and with Willie and with others, we've been looking at different aspects of climate change. And obviously all of these things are looking at energy policy is being heavily driven by climate change. And we just said, the problem is you get a lot of individual papers on aspects of energy policy or on aspects of climate change. But again, there's a lack of joined up thinking. Nobody is looking at all of them holistically. So Coilín was looking and saying, can we, where is this going? And I said, somebody needs to systematically review the literature on energy policies, and not doing it from a perspective of trying to promote one technology or destroy a technology, which is what most of the literature you'll see a recurring motif. We said,
and this paper is really part of that effort, right?
Yes.
It's a very broad overview of that. So, well, that's a good introduction, Ronan. So, Coilín, if you don't mind, give us a quick summary of your mini credentials.
Well, I'm a medical doctor, as I say, and I worked for several years in the hospital system, and I did a bit of work in general practice, and I decided on a career in public health because I was interested in broader issues. So public health is really the efforts of all aspects of society, both private and public sectors, to promote health and to prevent disease. So I took a master's in public health.
Go ahead. Well, I was going to say pandemics, epidemics, everyone's interested in public health now. This is quite the hot field.
Yeah, everybody has become epidemiologists in the course of the last year. It's kind of amazing to see people just climb this very steep learning curve about the epidemiology of infectious diseases. So all of that kind of thing, but also, it's to do with smoking policy, physical activity. It's to do with health service development as well. So I undertook training at the what's called higher specialist training here in Ireland, under the aegis of the Royal College of Physicians of Ireland. And during that, I had an exam. So I had to do 3 pieces of research, and I did one in each of the main domains of public health. So I did one that was to do with smoking cessation. I did another that was to do with health services improvement, to do with children staying in hospital unnecessarily. And I did a third one then in environmental epidemiology, essentially looking at the factors such as cattle density and private wells in rural Ireland, and statistically looking for associations between those things and certain waterborne diseases. Each of those 3 pieces of work turned into a published paper in a peer-reviewed journal. And on the basis of the third one of those, I'm in a long-standing research collaboration looking into that kind of thing, environmental epidemiology.
Gotcha. So then, so then, if you don't mind if I interrupt,
sure.
so this is quite a departure from you as a medical doctor to look at then energy and power systems. But I guess so. What, if you don't mind, if I just jump right into the paper here? I don't mean to cut you off, Coilín, but I want to
Sure.
make sure that our listeners and viewers on YouTube know, why we're here and what and why this paper now. I guess is you've looked at. If I can just briefly point, you say that coal, oil, and gas continue to supply 85% of the world's energy consumption, with hydro and nuclear providing most of the remainder. And then you reviewed the potential engineering challenges, environmental and socioeconomic impacts of the main energy sources. And you conclude, we find that literature raises many concerns about the engineering feasibility as well as environmental impacts of wind and solar. However, none of the current or proposed energy sources is a panacea. So that's kind of the overview. So briefly, tell me either of you tell me what was the purpose of the paper from the beginning? What was the motivation for you to look at this? And I think the punchline, as I would add here quickly, as you point out, $3.6 trillion was spent between 2011 and 2018, with more than half spent on wind and solar. But you're underscoring that by saying maybe this isn't the right policy. Is that a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
I mean, I've had a long-standing issue. I mean, a bit unusual in my profession, but I have a long-standing interest in social issues. And so I've been interested in climate change since the 1980s. And have just recently begun to look more closely at the research and just to begin to ask questions, because the question of energy is really important to health. We need energy so that we can have heating or air conditioning, refrigeration, emergency lighting, so that we can run water treatment plants and hospitals. And so the question arises, if we don't use, if we leave the fossil fuels in the ground, then what are our alternatives that can provide abundant, cheap energy to build good housing, to run hospitals and water treatment plants, to have energy available 24/7 on demand, so that you can have refrigerators working overnight, keeping food fresh, and so that if you wake up in the middle of the night, you can flick your lights on just like that, so that you don't trip in the dark. Fundamental things like this that are essential to the health of the population.
Yeah, the other thing, of course, is that, look, we touch on this kind of the whole Neo-Maltousian debate, and which we can get into the technical bits of it. But like the population has increased from 1 billion or 1.5 billion 2 centuries ago to touching 8 billion now, and through that process, it has been aided by the energy transitions that we have been doing, which has been predominantly from coal, oil, and gas. And there was talk of switching to nuclear, and that hasn't taken off, which we can talk about later on if you want. But the thing is, in order to, there's this kind of notion of these technologies that are supposedly called green, which is wind, solar, geothermal, etc. And that's how it's always described. It's interesting. You have groups like Greenpeace will always say wind, solar, and others, or wind, solar, or and it's always and others. And so the thing is, we're kind of like saying, well, if you're proposing to transition to something that is untested effectively for supplying 8 billion, 7.5 billion or whatever, we need to look critically at what is happening with each of these things. Because, okay, I'll just something that I've noticed on the media discussions and everything like this. If you have somebody comes on that's promoter for coal, the coal lobby, and they come on to the news and they start going on about how safe and wonderful and brilliant coal is, then everybody rightfully says, well, of course you'd say that. You're a coal lobbyist.
Sure.
If somebody comes on for the oil industry and they go on about how brilliant oil is, they say, of course. Someone for gas, of course. Someone comes on for nuclear, and you say, of course you're promoting nuclear. Somebody comes on for wind and solar. Let's listen to them. They're green. This sounds great. And, you know, that's what's kind of missing. I think if everybody already has the scrutiny of the coal, oil, gas, nuclear, to some extent now to biomass and biofuels, but then you have other people thinking they're part of the green, and then you have the hydro, you know, but then others saying they're part of the green because they're renewable, and then so now you're left with wind and solar effectively. And so if people if there was one takeaway from this, if your listeners or viewers are doing this, I would wish that next time somebody comes on promoting wind or solar, you know, that you would apply the same skepticism or cynicism that you would for one of the ones you don't like, you know, and just say that, yeah.
And I guess that would be my read of your paper. And by the way, just so we get this out of the way up front here, this paper was not sponsored by any other. There weren't any sponsors. This is something that the two of you took on because of your intellectual curiosity. Is that right?
Yeah. And I should mention the other co-authors. It's I already mentioned my father, Michael Connolly, and also Dr. Willie Soon, and also Jerry Quinn, who's another scientist who was also looking and saying, can we try and look at this? And so the key for this particular paper is we tried to do a holistic review of the literature. What's striking for me, what was so surprising in the paper is how little we had of our own input we needed to do. We were really just saying, this is what this study is saying. This is what this study is saying. And there's how many? I think there's 255. 255 peer-reviewed papers are cited in this. And largely, it's a review of all of those other things. And, you know, people that are interested can just check the references and look up for themselves, see if we've misinterpreted how they're doing it. We tried very hard to be as objective and to present competing sides. There's a lot of issues where there's debate, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, you know, even things like biofuels, things like energy return on investment.
Sure.
Are they is it above 1 or below 1, or is it above 5? All of these things.
Right. And where's the ring fence? Where do you decide what's included in the inputs and outputs?
Yeah.
So one of the things here that I think is really critical, I think, about the way, and by the way, the name of the paper is Energy and Climate Policy, an evaluation of global climate change expenditure 2011 to 2018. It was published in the journal Energies, and listeners can find it on your website. Is that right? Ronan Connolly Science?
Yeah, RonanConnollyScience.com is a list of all of my career, brief bio, and also links to all of the papers, and you can get a link to this paper and all of the others that if some people might be interested in some of the other papers we publish as well.
But if I were going to, you know, and the paper is now with citations 50 pages, the text is about 36 pages as I recall. Yeah. But you point out something that I'd never seen before, and your source on this. The Climate Policy Initiative has been publishing the annual Global Landscape of Climate Finance reports. And according to these reports, $3.6 trillion has been spent on global climate change projects between 2011 and 2018. 55% was spent on wind and solar. That's $2 trillion, which is an extraordinarily large amount of money. But these sources are, let's face it, they're politically popular.
Yeah.
You've been watching the presidential race here in the U.S. and Joe Biden has said, well, I'm going to build, we're going to put out 500 million solar panels. Why not 400 million? Why not 6? I don't know. 500 million and 60,000 wind turbines. Why not 75? It's specific numbers that he's saying this is what we're going to have. But this is the part that I think is really the most, the part that to me stands out. You said, despite all this spending of $2 trillion globally over this 8-year period, wind and solar energy still only produce 3% of world energy. That over that time period, it increased from 0.5% to 3%. And so while fossil fuels produced 85%, this raises pressing questions about what it would cost to make the transition to 100% renewable energies, which I never have, I've been writing about this stuff for a while. I never thought of it in those terms. If we spent this much to get to 3%, it's 2 trillion. Well, how many trillions more? And further, from where will that money come? And I think, is that what I'll ask each of you, if you don't mind. I mean, that's my punchline, right? So if I were to say, well, okay, Ronan, what's your punchline? If you had to just say, okay, what's your one takeaway? And then Coilín, I'd like to hear what you have to say about that.
Well, I think you mentioned the panacea. And for me, that's not. I think the main takeaway is none of the energy technologies that are the main ones that have been used are a panacea. And
we're going to need everything.
Well, what I would say is they all have their pros and cons. And what's happening is that whenever you have people that are pushing for, we're going to use this wind and solar, for instance, or coal or whatever it is, as soon as they're picking one and they're saying this will meet all of our needs. Like you mentioned, Joe Biden was saying he wanted wind and solar or whatever, Greenpeace and all of this. But you could also go the same with coal or with nuclear. As soon as they say, this is all, we'll do it all from this solves all our problems. And you're unaware of the cons, the pros, but not the cons. Then that ultimately, the saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions. If you are only aware of the good bits of the policies that you're pushing, then the more you pursue them, the more those negative consequences that are going to build up. And because you're unaware of them and you're not focusing on them, you're going to get disasters occurring. So one of the things for me, like one of the main things that we say it in it, policymakers, they should be explicitly aware of the pros and cons of their policies. We tried to avoid being policy prescriptive of saying, you should use this or you should use this. We said, look, every government, every policymaker has different priorities that they are trying to to promote, to push. And if they can, what they'll have to do is they have to decide what are their priorities and what are they prepared to compromise on. So just, are you looking at reducing CO2 emissions? Are you looking at energy security? Are you looking at the interests of the poor in your country? Are you trying to do socioeconomic values? Are you concerned about marginalized communities? All of the, are you concerned about air quality, water quality? Do you want to do it? So you have to pick, you have to say what it is you're doing. And here's the other advantage. If you are aware of the pros and cons, you can, if you are saying, look, this is what we're trying to do, and this is the best for trying to achieve those. But because we know, look, the saying, you can't make an omelette without breaking a few eggs. So if you know going in and you're explicit about it, look, when we do this, we're going to have these consequences. You can try to mitigate against those, or you can just say, look, that's what we're going to do. But yeah.
So Coilín, how would you summarize that? I mean, Ronan has hit on a lot of issues there, but if you were going to say one takeaway, and I'm asking for a simple, well, we live in an age where people want simple, but if you were going to boil down this paper to, one or maybe 2 points, what would that be?
Well, I would say much the same things in a different way. I would say that people really have got to look at, kind of take the green economy or the Green New Deal apart, because if you're interested, are you really interested in climate? Are you interested in other environmental issues? Are you interested in employment? Are you interested in energy justice? And you really have to get very focused on what it is you're about. I think in particular, there's a conflict between climate justice and energy justice. So the left in particular has gotten super hyper-focused on climate justice to the point that it has overshadowed energy justice. So I would say that people really need to think very carefully about that. Is climate change this life-threatening process that merits people, particularly on the left, putting all of this energy into and making a central plank in their policy platforms? Or should we keep an eye on the implications of this for energy justice, energy poverty? To come back to the figures, $2 trillion. And I want to say that I think that's I don't think people know what a trillion really is. We have an idea what a million is because we've been in cities of about 1 million. So that's 2 million times $1 million.
Right.
Just so that we're very clear what that is. 2 million times $1 million spent on wind and solar over the space of 8 years to increase the share of energy consumption they provide by 2.5 percentage points. So if you wanted to increase that to 50%, you need to spend about on the order of 20 times that.
Sure.
And then, that money has to come from somewhere. If you spend that money on wind and solar, or even on the other renewables, hydro, geothermal, and so on, then you cannot spend it on building energy adapted homes, on homes that are well insulated against cold and heat.
Or on vaccines for coronavirus, or on prepared let's transition a little bit here, because I think one of the other key takeaways I would say from your paper, I'm sorry to interrupt, but is you mentioned that idea about homes. What I'm ready to hear you say next is adaptation, and this is one of the things that is so, I think, important, that you write that greater investment in climate adaptation makes sense if society wants to better respond to climate change and extreme weather. You say, however, we also note the discussion that one of the key ways to help developing nations to improve their resilience to weather extremes is to encourage economic development. So you're saying that if we're going to adapt, particularly if poorer countries are going to adapt to climate change, then they're going to have to get richer, which is, you're not the only ones to make this point. Bjorn Lomborg has made this point. Michael Schellenberger's, many others, the Breakthrough Institute, the eco-modernists are saying some of the same things.
Yeah.
Why is there such reluctance? Now, this is a political question, not one about your paper, but why is there such reluctance, it appears, among the climate activists to talk about adaptation?
Yeah, okay.
Sorry, before you go on with that, I just want to talk about the numbers.
Yeah.
Sure.
That we found from looking at the finances. So we found that the 5% of of all of the expenditure on global climate change policy, only 5% went to climate adaptation.
Yeah.
Whereas 55% went to wind and solar.
Yeah.
And I just want to make the distinction between adaptation and mitigation, because adaptation means essentially being adapted, being ready for being adapted to the climate that is here, but also being prepared for whatever changes may come along. Climate mitigation means specifically
reducing greenhouse gas emissions.
So it's
specifically CO2 is the main one.
So this is really important, and I think really that, if you like, the global climate alarm movement has gotten super focused on the reduction of the greenhouse gas emissions. You know, they've gotten focused on saying, look, the fossil fuel industry is producing these emissions, and they're causing this global climate change. And then some people are saying, look, this threatens our whole civilization. You know, and
so that it's a mitigation only argument, right? That is we're only going to focus on mitigation but that smacks to me in some ways of, well, there's overtones of anti-capitalism. There's overtones of just, hating the energy companies.
But what I would say,
go ahead.
Sorry, what I would say to that, though, I mean, the strange thing is that it's just a different kind of capitalism.
Yeah.
I mean, you can see from the sums involved, that this is actually a mixture of private and public expenditure, and it's about half and half.
Yeah.
So what has actually happened is that the if you like, the global climate change movement that I was a part of for about 30 years has gotten so focused on big oil as the villain, and has lost sight of the fact that, well, actually, big oil has had 30 years to diversify their portfolio and to see this coming and to invest in renewables as well. So 5 out of the 8 oil majors are currently investing in the renewables. So ExxonMobil, for example, has this very, very just ingenious ad that you can find on YouTube, saying that gas and renewables go together like peanut butter and jelly. And they show somebody spreading peanut butter on one slice of bread and jelly on the other. Each one is great, and you put them together and they're perfect. Now, what ExxonMobil is actually doing here is securing its position in the market, because ExxonMobil knows that if we have big investment in wind and solar, they need some kind of backup for for when the wind dies down or for when the sun goes down.
And batteries are not going to be able to compete with gas.
Yeah.
When it
Can
comes to
that. I think Robert asked a very important question about why did it come, and also I want to pick up on the one or two things, just because I know the word alarm, climate change alarm, can be a bit triggering for some people. So the thing is, I think I know what you're trying to say, but it's like, you asked why the focus on mitigation as opposed to adaptation. Yeah. And I think actually Roger Pelkey Jr. wrote a very compelling paper. It's quite short, and you can get versions of it, back in 2005. I think it's Misdefining Climate Change. And if people aren't into papers, he also wrote a book, The Climate Fix, I think 2010-11, in which he goes into it in more detail. And he pointed out that in 1992, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change defined climate change as being any change in climate that it can be specifically related to the human modification of the atmosphere, which incorporated mainly CO2, but also aerosols and other greenhouse gases. The UN IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is supposed to be a sister organization, they use what I would consider a reasonable definition of climate change. Climate change is any change in the climate. This is it. So the various COP agreements, the COP agreements, the UN Conference of the Parties, so quite famously the Paris Agreement was signed at the 2015 COP agreement. All of those meetings, which are between policymakers, they're governmental things, their official framework for climate change, they are relying on the intergovernment or the UN FCCC definition, the Framework Convention on Climate Change. So if you, as Pelkey Jr. points out, if you define climate change as being only in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, well then if you want to reduce the harm of climate change, the only thing is, well, all we can do is to reduce it. And he said, look, if you use, say, the IPCC's definition of, if the government at this conference of policies, if they were using the regular definition of it, well, then they'd say, okay, so there's a mixture of natural and anthropogenic factors. Anthropogenic just meaning human caused. You know, let's do it. And then with that shift, suddenly it says, well, if the climate is changing anyway, you know, that there is natural climate change and we have weather extremes anyway, like, we're not going to stop hurricanes. Hurricanes have been around since long before the Industrial Revolution. And so actually, when you look at it, the main problems with hurricanes, if you want to do it, is when they are hitting societies that are not adapted, they don't have the infrastructure to deal with it, or the responses to deal with it, or the standby support to deal with it. So you can see, like, say, when a hurricane hits parts of the Gulf of Mexico, even a regular, like without getting up to the category 5s, but if you just get a category 1 or 2, if it hits a society that is not, you know, a developing nation, the effects on it are on the society, the people that are living there, are empirically much worse than when the same one hits, say, Florida or Georgia, you know, or like somewhere along the.
So, but if I can interrupt, but what hit my head, I'm not going to say triggered, but what jogged my thought in my head when you said that was that the adaptation that's necessary, whether it's hurricanes, typhoons, tornadoes, you know, extreme weather events of any kind, that
or sea level,
that the proper response now is we're going to have to adapt whether or not we think it's human caused or not.
Yeah.
That it almost the human caused part of it, as you went into the explanation about the difference between the UN FCCC and the IPCC.
Yeah.
But that ultimately, when it comes to us humans, the reason it's happening doesn't really matter. It's whether we're prepared for it or not.
Can I even sort of broaden the scope a little bit more? Because, you know, we need to be adapted to weather extremes already.
Yeah. Because
weather extremes happen already. You know,
regardless of why they're happening.
You know, look, I mean, there were two named storms hit Dublin in the course of the last year. You know, hurricanes. I've forgotten which names they were, but I slept through them. I heard a little bit of rain on the windows. That's all I heard, because I'm living in in an apartment building made of ferro concrete, and so it doesn't bother me. And you know, whether the climate changes, or whether those events become more frequent or not, it doesn't matter to me. If they happen twice a year or 10 times a year, it doesn't make much difference.
If you are adapted, if your society has the adequate infrastructure for dealing with it.
It doesn't bother me, because I'm living in a society that has the infrastructure. It has robust housing, it has well-insulated housing, it has good road networks, telecommunications networks, emergency services.
For the weather extremes that are the 1 in 100 year things that would, for our particular region.
But not just that, but I mean, it's adapted for the climate we have.
Yes.
So I live in an apartment building that is adapted to the damp, not extremely cold weather in Ireland. It doesn't get extremely cold here. It rarely, it rarely gets to the point where I'm afraid of my life when I go outside, let's say.
Yeah.
Which I would be if I were in the north of Sweden in winter.
Sure.
You really need to, it's dangerous to go outside in the cold winter in the north. It's not dangerous to go outside in winter in Ireland, but it's damp, so the building needs to be waterproof and so on. Other countries then need to be well insulated against heat waves, and they need to have air conditioning. And that's in that context, it can make very good sense to have solar panels on your roof, because when the sun shines most, it can provide extra energy to generate your air conditioning. So each society, depending on where you are in the world, north or how far north and how far south you are in particular, you need to have the appropriate kind of housing and the appropriate kind of services. You might need flood relief, or you might need drought relief. You have to be adapted to the kind of the temperature, the regular temperature pattern you have, the regular rainfall pattern, the regular wind, and also then to the kind of extremes that can come along, whether that be storms, floods, heat waves.
Right.
But so what we're saying is that once you have the appropriate housing in particular and the other infrastructure and the emergency services, that applies now. It's of value immediately now, and it's of value going forward, even into more frequent climate extremes.
But to go back to that original question, or what I first posed to you, is but this idea of spending on adaptation isn't sexy. It's not. I mean, it's not. It's critical, but as you point out in the paper, that's accounting for only 5% of about 3.7 trillion. So why has the investment been so skewed toward wind and solar, do you think?
Well, I start. Okay, well, now when you were specific about wind and solar, I'll have to modify it, because there's many factors involved there. But specifically, I think Pelkey Jr., Professor Pelkey Jr., in that paper, Misdefining Climate Change, and also in his book, he showed, look, that's a specific thing. If all of the negotiations on climate change are using the UNFCCC definition for what climate change is, well, then that creates a paradigm in which all of the policies are done. So it's a tunnel vision toward mitigation. Yes,
with only those specific remedies as appropriate for mitigation.
Yeah.
Can I point out something here that I find very striking and puzzling?
Yeah,
is that the IPCC, it's supposed to be looking at climate change, right? And it has recommendations or suggestions, regarding reducing greenhouse gas emissions, but it has excluded nuclear.
Yeah. That's what part of the thing I was saying when you said, as soon as you mentioned the wind and solar. And I probably should mention that I did myself and Michael and Willie, and also my mother Imelda, who's also a scientist, we did 2018, we teamed up with one of the founding members of Greenpeace, Dr. Patrick Moore, and we did a report, which you can again find on RonanConnollyScience.com. You can find links to it. But we looked specifically at Greenpeace, and actually, let's see, just so you can see, maybe it's a slightly a cheeky title.
Analysis of Greenpeace's business model and philosophy. Oh, yeah.
And then here we have Greenpeace
wants a piece of your green.
Yeah. Okay. So in that report, which was, we noticed that actually Greenpeace, we were looking at Greenpeace because, because we were working with Patrick Moore, and also Greenpeace had provided all of their financial reports for a long period, and so we were able to actually systematically look at what their expenditure was going, and also we had found a lot of research material from former strategy advisors for Greenpeace, and one of the things that they said, and we find that it is applicable to a lot of environmental NGOs, and so have to be careful in how I'm phrasing this, but this is, you can have a look at the report and to do it. There was a case study of Greenpeace, but environmental NGOs like Greenpeace, in particular Greenpeace, have found that they have effectively a business model. They're not for profit, but they still are raising funds and then expending it. And so Greenpeace have an annual revenue of, I think it's 400 million a year. So they're getting that largely from donations and from sponsorship. So in order to get these donations, what they do is they have campaigns. And they go and they say, here's what we're campaigning about. This is our things are important. And one of the things that they realized is that they need, actually, I'll just read this, from the executive summary, how we summarized it here. So their business model can basically be summarized as follows. 1, invent an environmental problem which sounds somewhat plausible. Provide anecdotal evidence to support your claims with emotionally powerful imagery. 2, invent a simple solution for the problem which sounds somewhat plausible and emotionally appealing, but is physically unlikely to ever be implemented. Now, that's a key bit. They have found when they do campaigns, it takes them typically 2 or 3 or 4 years for the campaign to start gaining a lot of traction. If their campaign is a simple solution that actually people can do, then it's say, oh, okay, we fix that, and everyone just does it, and then their campaign is over, and they have to come up with a new one. So that campaign wasn't as lucrative. So then they have 3, pick an enemy and blame them for obstructing the implementation of the solution and imply that anybody who disagrees with you is probably working for this enemy. And by the way, one of my colleagues, Dr. Willie Soon, had personal experience of this because he was writing lots of papers. So one of the former Greenpeace advisors, Kurt Davies, went and specifically came up with a smear campaign and implied that Willie was making loads of money from the fossil fuel industry, which all innuendo, which taking little bits of information that were half-truths and presenting it in a particular narrative. And, there you go. And then 4, dismiss any alternative solutions to your problem as completely inadequate. Now, the reason that I'm saying this is you can have a look at this report if you want to do it. But like Greenpeace, as one example, they are continually talking about, we give this as one section in the report, continually talking about transitioning to 100% renewables.
Sure.
And they say, and I'll just give you some quotes from this. It's like, because they always say, coal, like wind, solar, and geothermal.
Right.
And they imply that they have loads of others.
Sure. Let me interrupt you there, because I think that I want to just get to back to the specifics of your paper.
Yeah.
And just as a quick reminder, my guests, Coilín ÓhAiseadha and Ronan Connolly, they're the lead authors of a new paper, Energy and Climate Policy, an evaluation of global climate change expenditure 2011 to 2018, which is available on RonanConnollyScience.com.
Yeah.
But you talk about, and one of the things that I've focused a fair amount of attention on in my most recent book, and I mentioned it in my new documentary, Juice, is the land use issue. And so I'll ask that now I get myself out of the way here. Why does power density matter? Your paper talks about power density and compares hydrocarbon production, nuclear, et cetera, and solar and wind, and ranks them based on power density. Why do we care about power density?
Well, power density, it's a measure of the rate that you can produce energy for a given land surface area. And so it's really a a measure of the land area that is required for whether it's oil, gas, coal, wind and solar, biomass, nuclear, whatever it is. And basically, the big issue with it is that solar and wind require about 100 times more land area to produce the same amount of energy over any given time frame.
And biomass is the worst.
And biomass is worse.
Biomass / biofuels.
Sure.
Solar is of those three, among solar, wind, and biomass. Solar is the most the most power dense of those three. Wind requires a bit more area, and biomass more area again. So we're talking about between 100 times and about 1,000 times the land area that are currently required for fossil fuel powered energy.
Nuclear.
Well,
Sure.
nuclear requires less less area again than the fossil fuels.
Although, well, if I can interject, my calculations, and I can cite Václav Smil or Jesse Ausubel or David Keith and Lee Miller at Harvard. Biomass is about 1/10 of a watt per square meter. Wind is about 1 watt per square meter. Solar is about 10 watts per square meter. Whereas some of the nuclear power plants, particularly the one that I talk about in the film and in the book, Indian Point, 2,000 watts per square meter. I mean, the power density numbers are just are. So let me ask that about power density and why it matters particularly. Now, I know you're in Ireland, but what are the conflicts in Ireland over these kinds of siting issues? What are you seeing there, and more broadly, or can you talk about that a little bit in Europe? And I know this is outside the bounds of what's in your paper, but looking at it I'm in Texas, but looking at what's going on in Europe and in Ireland, there's been quite a lot of controversy over the siting of renewables, has there not?
Oh yeah.
Well, people can need land for different purposes. For cities, for agriculture, for biodiversity, for ecosystem services such as
tourism,
scenery. So in Ireland, in particular, the strongest winds are around the coast, and in general within Europe, the best wind conditions for generating wind energy are around the north and northwest of Europe. So we could put wind farms all around the west coast and the northwest coast of Ireland, but that then has an impact on the scenery. People go to the west because it's wild and they want to look out across the ocean.
But the other thing is that actually we have already done that. And so what's bizarre is because the Irish government and the Irish and all of the people that are lobbying for wind farms in Ireland, they keep on saying we need to increase it. And Ireland is part of the EU. So the EU has come up with these self-imposed greenhouse gas reduction targets. And so the government has, successive governments have believed that increasing the percentage of wind on the grid is a powerful way for doing this. But they actually, if you look at all of the sites that were first put up, they're all along the west coast, and they used up all of the best sites in the early 2000s, and they've now started, in the last 5-10 years, they've started putting them in the Midlands, which is the calmest part of the country, relatively speaking. And this is not in the paper, but we're working on another follow-on paper specifically looking at the Irish energy electricity supply, which that's a work in progress. So, but like what they're finding is they're putting all of these up, but it's what's striking is that most of the people that are promoting wind farms, I have noticed, are doing so. The wind farms are being put up in rural locations because that you need it to be in a rural location. But the people that are really pushing it the most tend to be in urban areas. And they're like, oh, we should be building more of these. And so it doesn't make sense to have it in Dublin City. So let's put it down in Offaly, in Westmeath, put them all over the place here, put them down, and it makes sense on a piece of paper. And so they're meeting these regulations. Well, a lot of the policies at the moment in terms of climate mitigation are all about getting these particular numbers for meeting certain targets. That's the thing. And it's not actually about what people should be concerned about. The energy policies, what are we doing about trying to protect the people and all of this? And that was actually something you mentioned about the left wing. A lot of the left has started to embrace these. Now, I consider myself left-wing.
So do I.
Yeah, but it is striking. For me, the left-wing has always been about protecting the interests of the working class, marginalized communities, trying to build, to look after this. And ironically, what we point out there's a big section in the paper on the socioeconomic implications of these policies. Ironically, most of the policies that are being pushed are preferential. They tend to be biased against the working classes, the poor in society, the marginalized communities, also the rural communities. There's a lot of the things like you have. It's wonderful. Like I live in the city centre here, and you do as well. So it's great to have a public transport system. And you could say, oh, it's great. Let's have a better public transport system. But that's great for all of the people living in the city. But if you're living 60 miles from the city, you can't get on the tram to do this. So, you need to use these older things. And again, as I was saying, the wind farms and solar farms are all being prioritized for. I'll put them down in the rural communities. Nobody's living there. So let's do it here. And
that's the same dynamic that's playing out here in the United States,
right.
and even in New York State, where the state has very aggressive renewable energy targets. The backlash in rural New York has been so extreme that the state has effectively told rural communities, we're not going to honor your zoning requirements. We're going to Bigfoot you. I mean, that is now happening in the state of New York over the objections of small towns, which is quite remarkable. But it is part of the, as you say, Ronan, this urban rural divide, which I think is not. It's clear here in the United States. Conservatives in the rural areas, the liberals dominate in the cities. But let me move back toward the paper again, because I think that there's another part of this that I want to talk about before we have to sign off, because we've been talking about this for almost an hour now.
Okay. Yeah.
But you talk about the issue of mineral use, and this is something that's getting more attention. The IEA released a report in May on that issue, the International Energy Agency pointing out the strategic minerals, lithium, cobalt. You talk about the issue of mineral activity. I'm sorry, the technologies I'm quoting here most vulnerable to mineral scarcity are solar PV technologies, and then you say tellurium, indium, silver, and manganese. Solar, concentrated solar, which is not very big, but anyway, that these things, tellurium, indium, silver, manganese, and then of course for storage, lithium and cobalt.
Yeah,
there's growing awareness that some of these aggressive targets for renewables and for storage are going to require massive amounts of mining, and so talk about that for a minute. How important are the mineral inputs in any kind of idea of a major energy transition?
Yeah.
I'll start off, I guess, and you can go into more detail. So the issue is similar to the land use issue in that the numbers are much bigger. So with regard to the mineral requirements for energy production from the renewables, and I mean across the so-called green energy systems, these require approximately 10 times as much, stuff to be brought up out of the earth, to be refined, to produce these energy systems relative to the fossil fuels. Yeah. So just to simplify, renewables require 10 times more quantities of minerals than the fossil fuel industry to generate the same amount of energy.
When you're saying renewables, you're mainly talking of wind and solar, and also the electric vehicles as well.
Yeah,
this was a point that was made, I think, by Richard Harrington from the London Museum of Natural History as well last year, in a very interesting, very short letter to the British government saying, you want to do all these electric vehicles in Britain, you're going to require essentially commandeering the entire global supply of copper, the global supply of cobalt, and so on, which I thought was really quite an important point that was made in the midst of this. Oh, well, we're just going to switch to something else. Well, it's just not going to be that easy.
Yeah, in the paper we talk about the different forms of scarcity, and there's a lot of ironies and all the things. Like a lot of the shift to renewables was inspired by this. I don't know if your viewers are familiar with this so-called Neo-Maltousian argument. So this is the overpopulation, the resource depletion. So
the debate that's been going on for 200 years, right?
Yeah.
That the Malthusians keep losing. So far, it's only been 200 years.
So this is kind of the thing, is that on the principles, the assumptions of what Thomas Malthus made was 1798, I think it was, in his prediction. He was predicting this isn't sustainable, the population growth is too rapid, and we're going to have mass starvation and all of these chaos and everything. And the population back then was, what, 1 billion or 1.5 billion? I can't remember. I think it was about 1 billion. Yeah, and... Well, we got up to nearly 7.5. We're over 7.5. We're nearly at 8 billion. And again, in the 1970s, you had people like Paul Ehrlich and the Club of Rome, and a lot of these groups started. Paul and Anne Ehrlich, they started looking and saying, basically rediscovering this concept and saying, it's going to keep, we can't keep going up, using analogies of, like, say, a petri dish. Like it's interesting. A number of people have pointed out a lot of Neo-Malthusians are coming from a biological background, and they're used to looking at biological systems and saying, you get these boom and busts, and they're like, so they are extrapolating from that, assuming humans are like a bacteria in a petri dish. And, you're probably familiar with, say, Julian Simon had his...
Sure.
I think he had his book, and he started in the 70s, assuming this was correct, that he was saying, and he said, well, we should already be able to find evidence of this resource depletion in the economic data. And then he tried looking, and everywhere he looked, it was the exact opposite. And I think one of his final books was something like The Ultimate Resource too. And he said the ultimate resource was humanity.
Right. So, human ingenuity. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, like, in terms of resource depletion, he says we're basically more than a bacteria in a petri dish. But the irony that seemed to have, we need to be renewable and sustainable. And so we're now switching to all of these technologies, which are requiring huge amounts of resources relative to what's there. And I just wanted to point this thing out. We don't mention it in the paper,
sure,
but it's something that I find troubling is wind turbines and a lot of these technologies are typically given an estimated lifespan of say 20 years. It's usually around 20 years. And 10 years, none of these wind turbines, after 20 years, 10 years, they've come up with a new wind turbine, which has an estimated lifespan of 20 years. They're always, they're not based on, when people say an estimated lifespan, the assumption is, a lot of people would assume, oh, so they've tested these for 20 years and that's how long it lasts. No, they run tests and they project forward what they reckon how long it'll last. They don't wait 20 years and say, well, we know it lasts 20 years, and then they're continually moving this. So this is a big concern, that in terms of the pie chart that we have of the technologies, I think a big one that is missing is R&D, because research and development, if you have a technology that you're continually, I really don't have fundamental problems with people saying, let's try and come up with solutions that we can do. But the problem one of the problems that we're addressing there is that before these solutions are doing, people are saying, now let's use this and start doing it. Let's spend 2 trillion installing these ones where we haven't ironed out all of the problems.
Can I come in there as well, that there are a couple of things, we've looked at the finance reports, and there are a couple of things that are strikingly missing. Ronan has mentioned R&D. Nuclear is not considered, because the IPCC has ruled that out as a route to decarbonisation. So it's not considered in these reports.
Well, I think the IPCC does consider it. Okay.
I think it's mentioned in passing, and I'll just make one quick point, Coilín, before I have you go forward. But it is interesting because it's something I've written about a lot, and I'm adamantly pro-nuclear. But the fact is, whether it's favored by IPCC or not, it's simply not growing. It is not capturing any greater share of primary energy globally. Yeah. Natural gas is gaining primary energy share relative to coal. But renewables are increasing, but as a share of overall primary energy at very small percentage increases. But anyway, Coilín, I interrupted, please.
Sure. Well, but the other thing that is strikingly missing is data about expenditure on storage.
Yeah.
Because
on batteries.
There are certain mature technologies, storage technologies, and there are developing ones. The mature ones include pumped hydro and certain kinds of batteries. Okay?
And pumped hydro might work in Ireland, but it's not going to work in West Texas or eastern New Mexico. I mean, there's not enough water.
I mean, if you're going to go that route, why not develop hydro itself as the energy generation technology? Why have it as backup?
Because hydroelectricity is one of the forms of energy that has a very low CO2 on greenhouse gas. CO2 in particular is emissions per kilowatt hour. The equivalent to wind and solar.
Can I just say a thing to come? Sure. Because this harkens back to the question you asked earlier. Why is so much of the focus on wind and solar? And I think what has happened is that those technologies that have been proven to be able to produce huge amounts of energy 24/7 on demand, right? There are basically 3 of them, maybe 4. There's fossil fuels, there's nuclear, there's hydro, and there's a bit of geothermal.
And you can use biomass, but then the power density issue. Okay. But you can,
But I think what has happened is that the environmental movement has identified the environmental impacts of all of these, and has brought them into popular consciousness. And precisely because they're mature technologies, they are the focus of critique. And so people are advocating for new technologies, which people are not so familiar with. And so they're somehow escaping, they say familiarity breeds contempt.
Yeah, sure.
So it's like people say, look, we know all the bad things about coal and hydro and nuclear. And so we'll do this new thing that doesn't have those. I think
that is a factor.
I think that's
it's a taking advantage of the ignorance. I'd say preying on ignorance, but I think it's also, and I've written about this myself, is that the public is innumerate and scientifically illiterate. They don't They don't understand numbers. They don't do very simple math. That's the only kind of math I can do, but also don't understand the concepts like power density. But I'll make a quick point here, because you both I've identified yourselves as leftists or of the left, but you sound like you could be from, or here in the U.S. from a conservative think tank or a conservative politician. Which, I mean, do you appreciate that, any of that irony of being?
I'll tell you, if you look at my website, RonanConnollyScience.com, I'm working on a book, Bridging the Political Divide on Climate Change, specifically, and so I spent the last year traveling around different people, trying to point out we need to start getting dialogue between different groups. The way I look at it is like, okay, you could be left-handed or right-handed, but you don't cut off your other hand just because you only use the other. You use both of them. So, if you have both hands, use them. You might mostly use one, but you can do that. So, there is a problem. Let's talk about, because your politics in the US, which is quite topical at the moment because you have this election, in Europe, we would consider the Democrats to be a conservative or right-leaning, center-right party.
I would be a little bit less generous than that.
Okay, so, well, if you look at what's happening is there is a very worrying thing, development that in the US it's particularly pronounced, but you seem to be exporting it to the rest of the world, where these echo chambers are developing, where people are refusing to listen to people outside of their own ideology. And so if they hear somebody, oh, I heard, if they're left-wing and they said, I heard you talk to a right-wing person, then it's like, well, then I can't listen to you, or vice versa, this kind of thing. And what I would say is that actually, fundamentally, like I had some discussions with, so you have this Green New Deal that some of your politicians came up with, and then there's some left-wing parties in Europe have said, oh, this is a great idea, we can look at that. And so I had some discussions with, so there's they're off the record discussions, but like, say there's a pan-European party, DM25, that are trying to use Green New Deal concepts for rebranding their things to promote socialist principles. But the thing is, the irony is that, this is what I was pointing out to some of the people that were saying, we'll use all of this, but I said, look, you're using this stuff. This is going against marginalized communities. This is increasing fuel poverty, energy poverty. You're the ones that are best able to deal with these higher cost policies are the upper class and the upper middle class, not the working class. And then it's like, if you're concerned about international things, issues such as global poverty or the rights of the indigenous peoples, as Coilín would talk about maybe, but also say the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo. At the moment, I think it's 65% of the cobalt
supply. Yeah,
is coming from there. And so all of that, we use cobalt is in smartphones and all of this stuff, but the electric car battery, when I first started looking at this, this is years ago, I was like, oh yeah, I have a car battery. You think of the car battery as you start, it's a small little thing, and so people, there's a natural thing. It's a nice segue. Car battery, electric car battery, you think there's something similar. The electric car battery is not replacing the little car battery you have under the bonnet. It's replacing the petrol or the gas tank or your diesel tank. That's what it's replacing. And it's like there's a huge amount of cobalt, lithium that is required for one electric car. It's like this is a first world solution, you know, to
well, and that's a good point, because I think what I heard, you know, my takeaway from what you just talked about, Ronan, is just this tribalism, right? And the refusal of the left and the right, regardless of what the names of the political parties are, but a refusal of the left and the right to kind of look towards some common solutions. But let me get back to the paper, and then I'm going to close out our conversation here in just a little bit. But I wanted to make sure that I mentioned this issue about carbon taxation, because this is an issue now that has been, well, I wrote about it 30 years ago and thought, oh, well, this is a good idea. And then the more I thought about it, I thought, well, this is really a bad idea. And now I'm convinced that it's implausible, because just very briefly, we don't have an international agreement to ban landmines. How we're going to ever get an international agreement on carbon taxation, I have no idea. But you say in the, you talk about carbon taxes, and you say that they tend to be regressive, I'm quoting here, and that carbon taxes have an underlying tendency towards greater income inequality. Why is that so? Why are carbon taxes have a tendency toward greger income inequality?
It's basically the same thing that we were just talking about. Like if you have a cheap form of energy and you are penalizing that because of its CO2 emissions, then the net effect is that you're penalizing this, so you're bringing up the cost. That's the corollary of it. If you're using carbon tax to penalize the more affordable energies,
right.
Or in the case of France, nuclear, or things like this, or like. So that tends to increase the energy cost. There's also, look at all of the other things, like one of the other things is that there's been a number of papers that have shown that it tends to, again, be biased, have worse effect on rural communities. Again, you have these wonderful transport, Paris, France is a perfect example, because they had the Gilets jaunes movement, the yellow vest movement. Right. It arose because Macron, the French president, said we need to increase carbon taxes, and so he put it. France has already. There's I think Professor Remy Prudhomme has made a good point. He just says, look, France is already winning on reducing CO2 emissions because they switched to nuclear for energy independence decades ago. So they have very low CO2 emissions per kilowatt hour across all of Europe. Right. But Macron wanted to push it further, so he started pushing on transport. And so, again, if you're living in Paris, and I was in Paris last year, the metro there is brilliant if you're in the Paris itself. But if you are living in the south of France, miles away from public transport, you need a car. You need to drive.
Sure. So it's another example of this unequal. It kind of exacerbate inequality because of simple geography, right? And this is one of the things. Obviously, I live in Texas, a very large state. Yeah, I mean, rural people don't have electric cars. There's no transportation. They drive big pickup trucks, and they with big engines, and this is the way they get around. So any kind of carbon tax on them would necessarily be regressive because they're driving more.
Yeah.
And can I come back to your point that that we sound like we're talking from a conservative think tank? I mean, what is striking about all of this is that if you like, that it seems like the right, if you say, the conservative view on energy policy is outflanking the left to the left. The left
that's a really good point, because and I think it's that what I keep coming back to is, well, what are the, so much of this policy is only viewed as, well, it's just policy. Well, no, ultimately it's about people, and it's ultimately about humans. And I bet the conservative view is, well, individual liberty and you're going to restrict or make energy more expensive. Well, that reduces human liberty, and that's not the right direction. I mean, is that fair where you're going, Coilín?
Well,
can I?
No, I just want to say this, because whether it's about liberty or not, what has happened in my perception, having followed, having been interested in climate change and being very concerned about it for more than 30 years, what has happened is that the concern about climate change has brought the left into alignment with what I would call a disruptive capitalism. So people are so concerned about oil that they have become enrolled in renewables, in particularly solar and wind. And it's as if they can't see, well, actually, the money, capital moves. These days, it moves in milliseconds. And so I think the left has lost sight of the fact that actually backing wind and solar in opposition to oil and gas is just backing another kind of capitalism, and not a very sensible one. And, so it's through this process of looking at the science, okay, we're left wing, but we look at the science and we look at what is possible, and we say, this is not practicable. And so, as leftists, we're supposed to be scientific, we look at the science and it doesn't give us the answer we were expecting to see. And so we have to say, well, much as we would like it to be true that wind and solar would deal with climate change and also deal with the other environmental aspects, biodiversity and employment and all of these things, when we look at it, it's actually not going to work. And so, and it risks causing energy insecurity, blackouts, people who don't have energy when they need it.
And again, it's regressive. And
it's regressive.
Yeah.
And we've got to go back and say, well, look, that's over there in the sort of unworkable fringe. And so we've got to come back here and say, actually, the old model, it's tested and it works, and it can provide enough energy for 8 billion people.
Yeah, can I build upon that a little bit? Because one of the things that what I was saying earlier about this echo chamber problem, I'm quite concerned about for me, and part of what we're doing is, your science should be about stress testing your ideas. You should be like, the term, the devil's advocate. You should be you have one hypothesis. We think this is working. Can we do the competing hypothesis and see what happens? And if they both can explain the data, well, then it's like, well, don't pick one over the other. Let's try and move forward. And if one of them starts to not explain the data, you say, maybe we should be changing our mind. What's happening within echo chambers with this is that if certain ideas are considered politically correct and certain concepts, and they have to be accepted completely
as part of the group identity, right?
Yeah.
As part of the tribal identity.
Yeah.
With no questioning.
Yeah.
And then I think is what makes this paper so interesting, right? Is that not only are you basically unaligned, right? You have a doctor who's working for the Department of Health in Ireland and an unaffiliated researcher who's, both have a lot of credentials, but are self-identified leftists saying, well, no, not so fast. So let me, we could talk. I know you all are very passionate about this, and it comes through talking with you, and you both have more points, and we could hit on a whole lot of points. But let me ask you just a couple of other things. And again, my guests are Coilín ÓhAiseadha and Ronan Connolly. They're in Dublin. They're the authors.
Can I say, just to correct you, I work for the Department of Public Health.
Department of Public Health, forgive me.
Public Health. No, the Department of Health is the Ministry of Health. I work for one of the 8 Officer of Public Health in Dublin.
Good. Thank you. So Coilín ÓhAiseadha, who works for the Department of Public Health in Dublin, and Ronan Connolly, who is a researcher and affiliated with the Center for Energy Research and
Environmental Research and Earth Sciences.
Center for Environmental Research and Earth Sciences. They're the authors of a new paper, Energy and Climate Policy and Evaluation of Global Climate Change Expenditure, 2011-2018, which you can find on ronanconnolly.science.com. But just to kind of, again, we could talk for a long time, but if one of the things I like to ask my guests is they usually are involved in interesting things, and I always like to know what's on the bookshelf. What are you reading these days? What is something that you've read recently that you like and could recommend to our listeners?
Well, I'm beginning to read for one of my next papers. So I'm beginning to look at the California redwoods, and I'm reading a book called Salmon and Acorns Feed Our People. So I'm trying to understand the interactions between the redwoods and other big trees of California and the impacts of colonialism on them from, let's say, 1850 onwards, into most of them have been cleared, and then the interactions with fire and with climate. So
the title was Salmon and Acorns Feed Our People? That's a book.
Yeah. Salmon and Acorns Feed Our People, and it's to do with the Karak people in California, and it talks about their way of managing the ecosystem, because they used fire frequently. They lit fires typically in October, and then the rains would come by the end of October and put the fires out. And they favored fire for a number of reasons. They favored fire to create prairies and to create routes for them to pass through. They used fire to disfavor conifer pines and to favor the oak, because acorns were one of their staple foods.
Okay. Interesting.
And so I'm looking at this in relation to the fires in California and in the other states of the West and Northwest in recent years, and trying to understand the interactions between the people and the forests and fire and climate. I'm particularly interested in to what degree changes in forest management, the colonial process has taken forest management away from Indigenous peoples, and to what degree has that contributed to potentially to changes in local and regional climate by affecting rainfall and wind and so on, and to what degree has that change in forest management contributed to the emergence of wildfires. The Indigenous peoples of California understood that by having controlled burns, that they reduced the risk of wildfires.
Interesting. So, if I can interrupt, I'll just, since you mentioned acorns, a friend of mine here in Austin, he's actually a historian, James McWilliams, wrote a very interesting book a few years ago called The Pecan. Pecans were a big source of nutrition for Plains Indians. So you might look that up if you're interested in nuts and indigenous people. It's quite an interesting book about the indigenous pecan in America. That's one of the I guess as he calls it, our native nut.
The paper mentions indigenous peoples. It's something that I have been reading and informing myself about for the last 4 years. So I've been reading books such as An Indigenous Peoples History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. There's a book called All the Real Indians Died Off, again written by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz in collaboration with Dina Gilio Whittaker, and books about Hawaii, New Zealand, indigenous peoples in many parts of the world have captured my imagination and curiosity for the last few years.
Sure. And what about you, Ronan? What's
Oh, well, you know,
you just can pick one or two. It doesn't have to be.
No, you see, this is the thing. This is what I'm like.
I had a conversation with Ronan recently. I asked him about a certain book. He said, it's in my stack of books.
This is like, you know, at the moment, that's just part one of the, you know.
He said it's in my pile of books to read.
Yeah.
And, you know, I was kind of a bit embarrassed and a bit perplexed and a bit amazed. I thought, you know, this guy has only one stack of books to read.
Yeah.
But no, it turns out.
Yeah, no,
like me, he has.
Yeah.
At least
Yeah, no, at the moment I mentioned that I'm working on a book on bridging the political divide on climate change, and I reckon if I sell as many copies as the books that I have read for doing this, it's got to be a bestseller. So yeah, this is it. It's like a lot of so I'm like a lot of stuff. I'm very interested at the moment in these concepts of like what is science, what is what is the left and right, what, you know, and what is politics. You know, you have the things. One of the things just to mention, because we were talking about it on this tribalism, what I find so striking when I visit the US, it's like if I meet somebody that is a registered Democrat or a registered Republican, and it's like I get the feeling that when you become a registered Democrat, you're given a checklist, a list of things. This is what you believe. And then if you flip it over, it's the other side. That's the one they said if you're a registered Republican. And everything is exactly inverted. And I think that's part of the problem. You know, particularly when you have, say, so many, like in the US, there's so many of the mainstream media channels do have clear, to me, it's that they have clear biases towards one particular party. And now
wait, they're biased? Really?
You know, and you can even see even like a lot of the big tech companies are starting, like there's a certain Silicon Valley mentality that I wouldn't have a problem with it. The problem is, I think any particular echo chamber, this is a problem. When you are in an echo chamber, when you are only surrounding yourselves with people who agree with you, this concept of an echo chamber, you say something and that's all you hear echoed back because everybody thinks the exact same way. Wherever you are, you can be close to the truth, but once you ensconce yourself in an echo chamber, you're going to start deviating from the truth. You know, because you're no longer critically questioning each of your things. And in fact, if anybody if anybody raises a question, then they're kicked out of this chamber for being inconvenient, you know. And I think that's part of the problem. And I do think that that's why, like, say this, the what you'd say, this progressive movement, or the, you know, of the left, you know, that's a part of the left wing, but I don't think represents the full spread of the left wing. But this particular one, this kind of all aligning with a particular narrative on particular issues. This is what you believe on climate change. This is what you believe on wind farms, you know, fossil fuels, all of this stuff. And when there's a checklist of what you are supposed to believe, and when that becomes part of your identity, then that's, you're no longer, none of your opinions then are actually informed opinions. They're ones that you've learned from your.
This is important because this comes up very strikingly when I'm interacting with people on social media. That, you know, there's a discussion about the wildfires in California, for example, and I'm questioning, you know, is this to do with global climate change, or is it to do with forest management? And people begin to talk to me as if I was a member of the religious right and say,
Sure.
Trust the science. And I'd say, yeah, that's right. Trust the science. How about you read the science?
Right.
Here's a paper talking about land use and land cover change. Have you read it?
Right.
And
but instead there's a de facto acceptance of, oh, well, there's someone to blame, or there's a policy to blame, and it somehow ends up with big oil or something else, which goes back to Ronan's point. So let me just tie this up, if you don't mind, gentlemen, because we've talked for a while. Your paper doesn't fit into any neat silo, and I think what your takeaway as Coilín, you said that you're underscoring the point, as you said, there is no panacea. There's no energy source that gets straight A's across the engineering, environmental, and socioeconomic challenges and concerns that you're identifying in the paper. So it's easy to be, and this is a question I ask of all my guests, it's easy to be cynical. It's easy to look at the world and say, oh, the political divides, the tribalism, the things we've talked about. What gives you hope?
Well, I like, for me, the science, all of the research that we're doing, it's amazing how scientific, when you actually look at the science and, you follow things, you discover that there is a lot of information that we can know. I think that there is a problem in bridging. That's why I'm saying I'm writing a book to try and help bridge the political divide of climate change. If that could be done, if you can get people that feel ideologically opposed to each other to start to say, hey, we're living on the same world. We're even living in the same country. Whatever policies are implemented will affect all of us. So let's have a discussion about it. There's a Professor Chantal Mouffe. She's a Belgian professor based in London, and she talks about the concept of agonism as opposed to antagonism. And she points out, she's quite left wing, but what she would say is any politically important point, if you have a strong political opinion on something, and you feel passionately about it, there's going to be people that you disagree with on that opinion, right? And you can try, one way of doing it is you can try and dilute your opinion so much that everybody agrees with you, but then you've lost what it is that you felt passionately about. So if you weaken your position by conceding, this is what I believe. Well, okay, maybe all I believe is that cat videos on YouTube are cute. And it's like, okay, well, that's not really a major thing. So what she's saying is we should embrace the fact that people of different ideologies or different political views disagree with each other. It's not wrong to disagree. It's not a bad thing to have people disagreeing. The problem is when we don't respect our people we disagree with. When we don't actually, and we refuse to listen to why they disagree. So if we can overcome these things, as I said, as we were talking earlier on, the Green New Deal is actually, as it's been is actually not a left-wing socialist policy, even though the people that are promoting it believe it is. But if they actually were to read Marx or to read, any of these things, and to say, actually, is this helping the working class? Is it helping the marginalized communities? So they'd say, oh, actually, we're not. It's not the right thing. So I think if we can get people that disagree with each other to do so respectfully and to listen to why does somebody disagree, rather than, if you disagree with me, then I will refuse to listen to you or I'll kick you out.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So Coilín, how about you? What gives you hope?
Well, what gives me hope is that some people are prepared to read the science. Some people start, very much entrenched in this idea of climate change as something that, threatens our civilization and threatens to extinguish us all within perhaps a matter of decades, and have held that view because they've just been given it.
But even there with this paper here, that says nothing about the solutions. Yeah. Okay. Sorry, I interrupted you.
I'm not sure how that connects, but
yeah.
But my point is that that we're talking about some people, and they have this idea. Look, we need to transition to wind and solar and to e-vehicles, and I say, well, not sure about that. I'm not sure whether it's actually feasible, and we can get in quite a debate, and because people are quite entrenched, but at least some people are prepared to take the invitation, and I say, look, read this, and if you don't read it, stop arguing. If you can't read it, or if you won't read it, then concede that you don't know.
Yeah.
Some people at least are prepared
to. I just wanted to just point out the thing is because if you read the paper, the issue of climate change, we refer to it intermittently, because.
But you're not aiming to make a political point about what you think the emissions are going to be or should be, but rather, and I think just to Coilín, I think when we talked about this before we started recording it, but was just that your hope isn't some specific outcome other than to have people read the paper and to do their own independent thinking. And so is that in terms of what gives you hope, is that's what you were going toward? Coilín was saying that your hope comes from this hope that people will be open-minded.
Yeah, look, we can see actually from what's going on, let's say, with regard to COVID-19, there is information chaos going on out there. There's science flowing around within the scientific community. There's real controversy one way or the other. And then there's people inventing stuff that is, a mixture of science and misunderstood things. And
right.
What gives me hope is that we're seeing people engaged in this, and we're seeing we're seeing various attempts to deal with this from a certain movement that says, look, this is dangerous stuff and we just got to get rid of it. That would not be my approach. What I see that is hopeful is that people are actually learning to talk to each other and say, listen, that movie, this pandemic thing, there's the point in it here about this patent on the vaccine, and actually you've misunderstood what it is.
Right.
And I think we're developing a collective consciousness via social networks to inform each other so that we can present something like that. And we can say, look, it's all some kind of weird conspiracy to manipulate us.
Then you can go on the other side where people, when there's the media narrative on this is very specific and suddenly, masks, which there is no epidemiological, we don't know whether they actually are having any effect or not. There's no evidence one way or the other. We don't know whether they are. Yet you have some people. That's it. There was a Gallup poll of the Democrats and Republicans in the U.S. and something like 70% of Democrats use masks all the time and believe they work, and the 70% of the Republicans don't believe, and say they don't work, and neither of them have any, we don't know, but let's not get into that country.
But what gives me hope is that people are engaging with this. People are at least presenting it and saying, look, here's a stack of evidence to say that they work, or somebody else comes and says, here's a stack of evidence to say that we don't know that they work.
And if I can just maybe put a bow on this, because we've talked now for quite some time, but what gives me hope is that here I've, from halfway around the world, I've, encountered the two of you have put out a paper on your own,
we should say, Jerry,
out of your own desire to try and further the conversation. And that to me is an example of the kind of engagement and the kind of intellectual independence and rigor that is needed. And that to me is hopeful. So if you don't mind, I'm gonna
Well, I think he's wrapping up. Sure.
I'm gonna tie it up here, gentlemen, because we've talked for some time. But many thanks, Coilín ÓhAiseadha and Ronan Connolly. Their new paper is Energy and Climate Policy. It was published in the journal Energies. You can find it at ronanconnollyscience.com. Gentlemen, I know I could ask you, is there something we've missed? And I'm certain there is.
I just wanted to make a shout out to our other co-authors on the paper, Jerry Quinn, and also my father, Michael Connolly, and also Willie Soon, that were also involved in this paper. And the one thing that I was just kind of say, for me, on the paper, if people are policymakers are saying our policies are evidence-based, if they believe, if that's an important thing to them, that our policies are evidence-based, well, they should be based on all of the available evidence. So if you are actually interested, if you're a policymaker or trying to engage with policymakers and you're pushing for evidence-based, please read the paper, and so that you can get all of the different perspectives, because when you realize that in the paper there's a lot more involved with all of them. As we say, there is no panacea. If you want to push stuff, if policymakers need to start thinking about what their priorities are and what they are prepared to compromise on.
Sure. Well, that's a good summary. Well, gentlemen, it's been my pleasure. Dr. Coilín ÓhAiseadha and Dr. Ronan Connolly, many thanks for your time. Thanks to all of you for listening. This has been another episode of the Power Hungry Podcast. Tell your friends, tell your neighbors, tell everyone you know. They should listen in as well. We're on all the major podcast outlets. And thanks again. Tune in next time for the next issue, the next episode of the Power Hungry Podcast. Thanks, y'all.
Thank you.